Imagine spending your entire adult life serving one man, building his empire tank by tank and kilometer by kilometer across half of Europe, only to have that same man personally sign a document calling you a coward and stripping everything you ever earned. Your rank, your pension, your uniform, your dignity, with a single stroke of his pen, and then 2 years later, when you finally decide enough is enough and try to put a bomb under his desk, the bomb goes off, the man survives, and you end up strangled on a piece of piano wire while cameras roll, and the man you tried to kill sits in his bunker watching the footage the same evening with a glass of tea. That is not a story someone invented. That is the actual life of Erich Hoepner, and if you think you already know how it ends, I promise you there are details in this story that will genuinely surprise you. Erich Hoepner was born in Frankfurt an der Oder in 1886, which means he grew up in a Germany that was still figuring out what it wanted to be. A young empire full of military tradition, Prussian discipline, and an almost religious belief that a man proved his worth in uniform, and Hoepner absorbed all of that completely and without reservation from the very beginning. He entered the German military as a young officer before the First World War, served through that catastrophic conflict, survived the humiliation of Versailles, watched the old imperial army get dismantled down to 100,000 men, and still stayed, still believed, still worked his way up through the ranks of a military that technically had no future, because men like Hoepner simply did not know how to be anything other than soldiers. By the time Adolf Hitler came to power and began rebuilding the Wehrmacht into something enormous and terrifying, Hoepner was already a senior officer with decades of experience. And when Germany started developing its new armored doctrine, fast-moving Panzer divisions that would tear through enemy lines before the enemy even understood what was happening, Hoepner was exactly the kind of commander who understood instinctively how to use that kind of power. What made Hoepner genuinely dangerous as a commander was not just his technical understanding of armored warfare, but his willingness to push further and faster than almost anyone else around him, because he grasped something that a lot of traditional German officers struggled with, which was that the entire point of a Panzer division was speed and aggression and the complete psychological destruction of the enemy's ability to respond. And if you stopped to wait for permission or reinforcements or the perfect moment, you had already lost the advantage that made the whole thing work. When Germany invaded Poland in September 1939, Hoepner's 16th Motorized Corps performed exactly as designed, fast, brutal, effective, and when the real test came in May 1940 with the invasion of France and the Low Countries, Hoepner led his panzer divisions through Belgium and into France with the kind of momentum that left Allied commanders genuinely unable to process what was happening to them fast enough to stop it. France fell in 6 weeks. The world was stunned. And Erich Hoepner was exactly the kind of man who had made that possible. But the campaign that would define everything about Hoepner's story, the one that would set in motion every single event that followed, was Operation Barbarossa, the German invasion of the Soviet Union that began on June 22, 1941, which was one of the most consequential and ultimately catastrophic decisions in the entire history of the Second World War. Though in the summer of 1941, that catastrophe was still months away, and the initial German advance was moving so fast that some commanders genuinely believed the Soviet Union might collapse within weeks. Hoepner commanded the 4th Panzer Group as part of Army Group North, driving toward Leningrad, and in the early weeks of Barbarossa, his forces advanced hundreds of kilometers, smashing through Soviet defensive lines and capturing enormous numbers of prisoners in a series of encirclements that looked, on the maps in Berlin, like exactly the kind of decisive victories that were supposed to end the campaign quickly. The problem, which became apparent slowly and then all at once, was that the Soviet Union was not France. The Red Army was not the French army, and the distances involved were on a scale that Western European campaigning had not prepared the Wehrmacht for in any meaningful way. As autumn turned to winter in 1941, and the German advance slowed and then stalled in the face of ferocious Soviet resistance, brutal cold, and supply lines stretched far beyond their functional limits, the situation on the Eastern Front transformed from a victorious campaign into something that started to look genuinely dangerous. And it was in this context, this grinding, freezing, desperate winter, that Erich Hoepner made the decision that would ultimately destroy him. By December 1941, Hoepner had been transferred to command the 4th Panzer Army as part of Army Group Center, which was the force that had come within sight of Moscow before being stopped and then thrown back by a massive Soviet counteroffensive. And as the Red Army pushed hard against German lines that were exhausted, frozen, and in some places on the verge of collapse, Hoepner made a judgment call that any rational military commander looking at the situation on the ground would have recognized as necessary. He ordered his forces to conduct a tactical withdrawal from positions that could not be held in order to establish a more defensible line and prevent his army from being destroyed in place. It was the kind of decision that saved lives, preserved combat power, and made basic military sense. But it was also a decision made without explicit authorization from Adolf Hitler. And in January 1942, that distinction turned out to matter enormously. Hitler's response to the Soviet winter counteroffensive was one of his most famous and most catastrophic military doctrines: the absolute refusal to permit any withdrawal under any circumstances, the order that every German soldier would hold his position regardless of the tactical situation. That ground once taken would not be yielded, that retreat was cowardice, and cowardice would be punished with death, and that the strength of German willpower would overcome any material disadvantage the enemy possessed. It was an idea that ignored every principle of military reality, that treated the lives of soldiers as abstractions in service of ideology, and that would go on to kill an extraordinary number of German men in the years that followed. But in January 1942, it was the law, and Erich Hoepner had broken it. What happened next was something that had genuinely never happened in the history of the German military, something so personally humiliating and so publicly brutal that it was clearly designed not just to punish Hoepner, but to send a message to every other officer in the Wehrmacht about what happened to men who made independent decisions that contradicted the Führer's will. Hitler personally signed an order, not a court-martial, not a military tribunal, not any kind of formal legal process, just a direct personal decree that stripped Erich Hoepner of his rank, his right to wear a military uniform, his pension, all the benefits he had earned over decades of service, and his status as a soldier of Germany, effective immediately. And the language Hitler used in that order was not the dry, bureaucratic language of military administration, but something far more personal and vicious, calling Hoepner a coward who had fled before the enemy in defiance of his orders, framing a rational tactical decision as a moral failing of the most fundamental kind, and making sure that everyone in the upper reaches of the Wehrmacht understood exactly what had happened and exactly what it meant. Hoepner was removed from command, sent home, and left in a kind of legal and social limbo. No longer a general, no longer a soldier, stripped of the identity he had built over his entire adult life, but also not formally charged with any crime, just erased from the military as completely as Hitler could manage through personal decree. To add a final layer of humiliation to the whole affair, Hoepner actually attempted to challenge the dismissal through German courts, arguing that even in wartime, a senior officer had legal rights that could not simply be abolished by personal decree. And there is something almost poignant about that. A man who had spent his life in an institution that operated entirely outside civilian legal norms, suddenly trying to invoke those norms to protect himself. And predictably, the courts ruled against him, because in Nazi Germany in 1942, ruling against Adolf Hitler on a matter he had made personal was simply not something that happened. So Erich Hoepner went home. And here is where the story takes the turn that makes it genuinely extraordinary, because what Hoepner did with his forced retirement was not what most disgraced officers did, which was to retreat into bitterness and silence and wait for the war to end one way or another. Instead, Hoepner began making contact with the network of military officers and civilians who had been quietly discussing, planning, and arguing about the possibility of removing Hitler from power, a network that had existed in various forms since before the war began, and that by 1943 and 1944 had coalesced around a serious operational plan to assassinate the Führer and seize control of the German government, a plan that history remembers as Operation Valkyrie, and specifically as the July 20th plot. What motivated Hoepner to join this conspiracy is a question worth sitting with for a moment, because the easy answer is that Hitler had destroyed his career and humiliated him publicly, and he wanted revenge, and that was probably part of it. But the picture that emerges from accounts of the conspirators suggests something more complicated than simple personal grievance. Hoepner had seen the Eastern Front up close, had watched what the war was doing to Germany and to the soldiers under his command, had formed views about Hitler's military competence that were not complimentary, and had reached conclusions about where all of this was heading that made the risk of conspiracy feel more rational than the alternative of simply watching it unfold. The plan that the conspirators developed was audacious in its ambition and tragically flawed in its execution, and the gap between those two things is what makes July 20th, 1944, one of the most studied and most debated days in the entire history of the Second World War. The core of the plan was straightforward enough. Colonel Klaus von Stauffenberg would carry a bomb in a briefcase to a military conference at Hitler's headquarters in East Prussia, known as the Wolf's Lair, place the briefcase under the table near Hitler, leave the room on a pretext, and detonate the bomb remotely. And in the chaos following the explosion, the conspirators in Berlin would activate Operation Valkyrie, a genuine Wehrmacht contingency plan for dealing with civil unrest, and use it to seize control of key government and military installations, arrest SS leadership, and present Germany and the world with a fait accompli. Hoepner's role in the plan was significant. He was designated to take command of military forces in the Berlin area once the coup was underway, which meant he was at the center of the operation, waiting in Berlin on July 20th for the news that Hitler was dead, and the next phase could begin. What happened instead was one of the most frustrating near misses in history. Stauffenberg placed the briefcase, left the room, and the bomb detonated at 12:42 in the afternoon with enormous force, destroying the conference room and killing several people who were standing near the table. But Adolf Hitler, by a combination of luck and the accidental repositioning of the briefcase by another officer who found it inconveniently placed, was standing far enough from the point of detonation that he survived with relatively minor injuries. A perforated eardrum, some burns, shrapnel wounds that were painful but not life-threatening. And when Stauffenberg, watching from a distance, saw the explosion and assumed no one could have survived it, he flew back to Berlin to report success and set the coup in motion, not yet knowing that the man he had tried to kill was already on his feet and on the phone to Berlin. What followed in the next several hours was a disaster of communication, hesitation, and bad luck, with the conspirators in Berlin unable to move decisively because the news from the Wolf's Lair kept shifting. Hitler was dead. Hitler was alive. The bomb had worked. The bomb had failed. And the window during which bold action might have carried the day closing minute by minute, while key figures waited for confirmation that never came in the form they needed. Hoepner was there, in the Bendler Block military headquarters in Berlin, participating in the increasingly desperate attempts to make the coup work, even as it became clear that Hitler had survived, and loyalist forces were beginning to reassert control. And he kept going, even when most rational assessments of the situation would have suggested that the moment had passed, and the outcome was inevitable. By the evening of July 20th, SS and loyal Wehrmacht forces had retaken the Bendler Block. Stauffenberg and 3 other conspirators were shot in the courtyard within hours of the building being secured, and the arrests that followed over the next days and weeks swept up hundreds of people connected to the conspiracy in any way, from the central planners to people who had heard rumors and said nothing, and the scale of Hitler's fury at the fact of the conspiracy, at the knowledge that senior military officers had tried to kill him, translated into a campaign of retribution that was deliberately designed to be as humiliating and as visible as possible, because he wanted every remaining officer in the Wehrmacht to understand what happened to men who betrayed him. Erich Hoepner was arrested within days, and what awaited him was not a court-martial in any meaningful sense of the term, but something called the People's Court, presided over by Roland Freisler, who was arguably the most terrifying judge in the history of Nazi Germany. A screaming, theatrical, deliberately sadistic figure who conducted trials not as legal proceedings, but as public humiliations, interrupting defendants, mocking them, denying them the ability to speak in their own defense in any coherent way, and delivering verdicts that had been decided before anyone walked into the courtroom. The footage of Hoepner's trial before the People's Court is genuinely difficult to watch even now, not because of graphic violence, but because of the sustained, methodical humiliation on display. Freisler, screaming at a man who had commanded hundreds of thousands of soldiers, calling him a coward and a criminal, refusing to let him speak, treating him with the kind of contemptuous dismissal that was clearly calculated to strip him of whatever dignity he had left before the sentence was carried out. Hoepner stood there in civilian clothes because he had no right to a uniform, and he attempted to defend himself and explain his reasoning. And none of it mattered in the slightest, because the outcome had been decided by the man who was watching execution footage in his bunker that evening. And the sentence was death, as it was for virtually everyone who stood before Freisler on charges connected to the July 20th plot. On August 8, 1944, Erich Hoepner was taken to Plötzensee Prison in Berlin, where the method of execution chosen for the July 20th conspirators was hanging. But not the quick, relatively humane hanging of a properly calibrated drop, but a slow strangulation on a thin loop of piano wire suspended from a meat hook. A method deliberately chosen to maximize suffering and to produce footage that would be as degrading as possible. And the executions were filmed on Hitler's direct order so that he could watch them, which he did that same evening. And what he watched was 8 men dying slowly and horribly for the crime of trying to stop a war that would go on to kill millions more before it finally ended. Erich Hoepner was 57 years old when he was killed at Plötzensee, which means he had spent the better part of 4 decades in uniform serving Germany in one form or another, had commanded panzer forces across Poland, France, Belgium, and the Soviet Union, had been one of the architects of the Blitzkrieg doctrine that remade modern warfare, had been publicly humiliated and stripped of everything by the man he served, had joined a conspiracy to remove that man from power, had watched the conspiracy fail by the narrowest possible margin, and had then been subjected to a show trial designed to humiliate him before being strangled on a wire, while cameras recorded it for the entertainment of the man he had tried to kill. There is something almost incomprehensible about the arc of that life, about the distance between the young officer who believed in German military tradition and the man dying on a hook in a Berlin prison while the country he had spent his life serving collapsed around him, and it raises questions that do not have easy answers about loyalty and its limits, about what it means to serve an institution that has been captured by something monstrous, about at what point the calculation changes and the risk of action becomes more rational than the comfort of compliance. What is worth remembering, in the end, is that Hoepner made that calculation, late, imperfectly, and ultimately unsuccessfully. But he made it at a moment when the cost of making it was as high as it is possible for a cost to be. And while it is true that his earlier career included participation in campaigns that caused enormous suffering, and that his motivations for joining the conspiracy were probably not entirely pure, the fact of his participation in an attempt to end the war and remove Hitler from power is part of the historical record, and it is a more complicated legacy than either simple heroism or simple villainy, which is probably the honest thing to say about most of the people caught up in the machinery of that particular catastrophe. The men who tried to kill Hitler on July 20th, 1944, did not succeed, and the war went on for another 9 months, and millions more people died in those 9 months. And the piano wire at Plötzensee did not stop anything. But the attempt was made, and Erich Hoepner was part of it. And that is what history remembers about a man who spent most of his life being something much less interesting than that.